Welcome back to Story Recaps. Today I'm going to explain the movie, Buried, released in the year 2010. The movie begins, and we see a man, who is locked in a box. This man's name is Paul Conroy. When Paul regains consciousness, he is quite frightened. Paul is an American truck driver, who was working with his colleagues in Iraq. But yesterday these people were attacked, killing many of Paul's companions, and he fainted. Now when Paul comes to his senses, it is locked in this coffin. Paul has a lighter, that he uses to light the coffin. Paul takes the cloth out of his mouth, shouts for his help, but there is no one here to hear it, because it was buried alive in the ground. Paul sees a nail in the coffin, using which he frees his hands. Paul tries hard to open this coffin, but he cannot open it. Paul hears the sound of vibration in this coffin. When Paul checks, he sees a mobile phone near his feet. It was very difficult to reach that phone, because there was very little space in the coffin. Paul brings the phone to him with great difficulty, but the surprising thing was that this phone is not Paul's. The language in the phone was Arabic. Paul does not understand Arabic, so he quickly checks his pocket. Before this there was a wallet in the pocket, but it was empty. In the second pocket there was some alcohol and painkillers pills, but all this was of no use to them. Paul quickly calls emergency number 911 for his help. Paul tells them that my name is Paul Conroy. Someone has buried me here in the ground, so please help me. But Paul comes to know here, that the emergency number he has called, is located in a small town in Ohio, USA. Paul is currently in Iraq, so those people cannot help him. He sees that there are 3 bars in the battery now. After thinking for a while, he calls his home, but no one picks up the phone. Paul leaves a voice message for his wife Linda, in which he says that I have been attacked, so you should contact the National Guard quickly. Paul calls on his wife Linda's mobile, but Linda also does not pick up the phone, so Paul leaves a message there too, and says call me back, because I am locked in a box, and I cannot breathe. After this Paul calls 411 and tells them, that I have to talk to the FBI. They give it the number of Chicago. There was a pen and pencil, then Paul notes down that number. Paul now calls the FBI. They pick up Paul's phone. Paul tells them we were going in trucks with our stuff, but on the way these people were attacked, due to which many of his companions were killed. Paul was behind so he survived, but a stone hit his head due to which he fainted. Paul thinks that those attackers have buried him here. On hearing this, the people of FBI say, that why they did not kill you. Paul does not have the answer. FBI people ask for Paul's social security number, but Paul does not have that number. Then suddenly the call gets disconnected, because the signal goes away from the phone. To bring the signal, he moves the phone around in the coffin, due to which the signal comes again in the phone. The company where Paul worked calls there, but no one picks up calls there too, so Paul leaves a voice message here too. Paul becomes very frustrated, and feels that no one is going to come here to help him. Then suddenly he remembers, that he is forgetting something. Paul did not see the number, from which he was getting calls. The phone still had signal, so it calls back on that number. The call picks up a man named Jobber. Jobber is the same man who buried Paul alive here. He demands $5 million to free Paul, that too by 9 o'clock in the night. Otherwise he will leave Paul to die here. But Paul tells him, that I do not have that much money. After hearing this, Jobber says that you take money from your embassy. He cuts the call by saying, Paul understands that if he wants to stay alive, then he will have to contact his government, and ask them for $5 million, so that he can get out of here. Paul calls one of his friends Donia, and asks where is Linda, but Donia says she doesn't know. Paul says to quickly search the number of State Department, and give me the number, but Donia says that she has some urgent work, so she is going to the market now. Upon hearing this, Paul starts shouting at her, due to which Donia angrily cuts the call. Paul now had no other way, so he calls Donia again. This time Paul apologizes to Donia, and lovingly takes the State Department number from her. Paul calls the State Department, and tells them his problem, but surprisingly, they already knew Paul's name. Paul says, how do you people know my name, whereas I didn't tell you my name? Those people say, that in the company where you used to work, you had left a voice message by calling some time ago. We got that message. At this time Paul is talking to Rebecca. He tells him, that the kidnapper has already asked for $5 million, before 9 o'clock, otherwise he will kill me, so I want you to talk to him. But Rebecca says that I cannot do this, because it is against the policy of the government. Rebecca gives Paul the number Dan Brenner. Dan Brenner, head of the Hostess Working Group in Iraq. This group was formed in 2004, and Paul is not the first person with whom this is happening. Rather before that such incident has happened to many people. Paul talks to Dan. Dan says I know about your condition, and don't you worry, we will get you out of there before 9 p.m. They forbid Paul to talk to anyone else. Dan says we are finding for you. It is difficult to trace your phone, but the good thing is that signals are coming in your phone, which means that you are not buried too low in the ground. We will find you soon. Paul asks Dan about his companions, but Dan says that he hasn't found any of his friends. Dan asks Paul to save the battery of the phone. Both of them were talking when the kidnapper calls Paul. Kidnapper says you have only 2 hours left. Paul says that no one will give you $5 million. Hearing this, Kidnapper says that okay, give me only $1 million, and send me a video of yours. he says that there is a box near your feet, in which there is a note. Read that note and make a video and send it to me. It was very difficult to reach that box, because there was very little space in the coffin, but Paul still somehow brings that box to himself. The box contains a torch, a knife and a note, which he had to read and make the video. Before making the video, Paul calls Dan and gives him Jobber's number, so that they can trace him. Dan forbids Paul to make the video, and says don't worry, we will save you. Paul says that this has happened to so many people. Dan says that it has happened to many people, but we have saved many people. 3 weeks ago we rescued a 26-year-old boy who was a student, and he is currently with his family. Paul gets some comfort listening to Dan. Just then Kidnapper calls Paul, and forces him to make the video, but Paul does not make the video. After being alone for a long time, Paul misses his mother. Paul calls his mother to talk to her, but she does not recognize Paul. Seeing this, Paul is very sad and he starts crying. Just then Kidnapper sends him a photo. This photo was of a colleague of Paul's, who used to work with him. Kidnapper had imprisoned him too. Paul quickly calls the kidnapper and says, don't kill him because he has 2 little kids. Kidnapper says I had 5 kids, but now there is only 1. You send me the video within 3 minutes, otherwise else I will kill him. Paul now had no other way, so he records the video and sends it. Paul was very disappointed and tired, so he falls asleep. Sometime Paul wakes up, because he feels something in the coffin. Actually a snake had entered the coffin. This snake came through a hole in the coffin. Seeing the snake, Paul freezes, due to which the snake comes out. Paul pours alcohol on that side and sets it on fire, so that the snake comes out of the coffin. After letting the snake out, Paul now breathes a sigh of relief. Then Kidnapper sends him a video. This video was of the same girl, whose kidnapper had sent a photo some time ago. Kidnappers kill that girl. After watching the video, Paul gets very scared and understands that he too will not survive, because they will kill him. Paul thinks of committing suicide here, but then he misses his son, because of which he does not commit suicide. Paul's son's name is Shen, and he has to get out of here for his son. Then Dan calls her and says, why did you make the video? They have uploaded that video on every social media handle, due to which that video is becoming increasingly viral. Hearing this, Paul says that you guys are just making a fool of me. You are not going to help me. You will just talk to me till I die. Dan says that my team is looking for you, and we are going to reach you soon. Paul thinks that his video is going viral, so his government will definitely do something to save him. Dan was encouraging him, that then there are many blasts here. Because of the blast his coffin breaks, and when the coffin breaks, the sand starts coming in. Paul sees that the sand is constantly coming in, and if he does not close the whole coffin will be filled with sand, due to which he will be buried alive. Paul somehow closes that hole, but the sand was still falling inside. The phone's battery was about to run out, so Paul calls Dan. Dan says that the blast that happened near you right now was done by our fighter plane. Paul felt now that maybe that kidnapper might have been killed in this blast, but what is the use of that? He is still buried under the ground. Paul begins to feel that Dan will no longer be able to save him, so he becomes very disappointed and gives up all hope of living. Paul records a video message for his family, and then suddenly calms down. But then Kidnapper calls him. Actually Kidnapper would not have died, rather he was still alive. Kidnapper asks Paul to make a video of him chopping off one of his fingers, but Paul refuses to do so, because he was going to die here anyway. But Kidnapper tells Paul the address of his house and says that if you don't make the video, we will kill your family. Paul hurriedly calls his wife Linda, but she doesn't pick up the call. Now even without wanting, Paul has to cut his finger, and make a video of it and send it to Kidnapper. With the finger amputated, Paul is in great pain and he lies quietly. Only then Paul hears noise from above, and the coffin opens. There is bright light outside. Paul thinks he has been rescued, but it doesn't because he was still in the coffin. Paul is just imagining all those things. Death was so close to him because the coffin was constantly filling with sand. Dan calls Paul and says we've got to you. We've got a rebel, who knows where the American man is buried. You just wait a while, we get you out. Then Linda calls him. Actually Paul's video was being shown on every news. Seeing that Linda quickly calls Paul, Paul tells him I'm alright because I've been rescued, and I'll be home soon and see you. Saying this he cuts the call, because Dan was on hold. Dan says, we're over the coffin and we're getting him out. Now the sand starts filling inside the coffin very fast. Paul says hurry up, get me out of here. Dan takes out the coffin, but the surprising thing was that the coffin is not Paul's, rather the coffin is of Mark White. Dan says oh my god, this coffin belongs to Mark White. That means the coffin that Dan took out is not Paul's, rather another man's. Dan says to Paul, sorry Paul, the first could not save you. The sand fills completely in the coffin, due to which Paul is killed. And with this the film ends.